Hello, I'm George Malin, the Managing Editor of IoT Now magazine. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm delighted to be joined by Mike Fallon, the Director and Senior Advisor of PTC's IoT Transformation Advisory practice. Mike has chosen to speak on the fascinating topic of how to monetize your IoT investment and the thorny topic of how, beginning with why. This looks very interesting. Clearly, lots of organizations across the world are making substantial investments in IoT, but getting that return and achieving that monetization requires thinking about why you've made that investment in the first place. I won't steal any more of Mike's thunder, and I'll hand over to Mike now. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, George. Pleased to be here. And just to build off that introduction, one of the things that we say around how it begins with why, and we'll talk about this in the session here, is also beginning with the why for the user. And when people think about monetization, why should somebody pay for your service? And we'll get into that in more detail. And before that, I'd like to just do a quick introduction of PTC for those that may not be familiar with us, as well as the advisory practice. First and foremost, very, very high level, PTC is a company that has been working with clients for many years. And in essence, we help customers create, manufacture, service, and of course now with AR and what we're doing here in monetization, develop experiences around their physical products. Not to go through this in detail, but you'll see here that third-party analysts show that PTC remains a leader in the IoT and AR industries, and I think between this data and our customers, this speaks well to who we are and how we play in this business. And then in terms of the advisory practice, we're a new group that's part of the Customer Success organization. Customer Success now formerly known as our services organization. As we've moved to a model around subscription, like many, we look at our business quite differently. And by doing so around customer success, we've built an advisory practice that's begun to leverage research and findings from the work that Jim has done with Michael Porter at Harvard around competition and transformation of companies around IoT, as well as how we help companies transform their journeys from where they are today to where they want to go. So as we get into the session, one of the things that I found interesting as we began to take a look at this topic, frankly, back in 2015 is recent data from Gartner shows that, unlike our days of coming out of the recession period, growth is a real top priority now within CEOs. And we feel this is really part of the driving factor of why our customers and CIOs are asking questions where formerly were basically around efficiency and productivity, which remains the case, but now really focusing more on how to grow the company. And what I find interesting here as well is the other topics of focusing around the product, the customer, what's happening within the corporate organization, frankly, around silos, and also around the importance of IT is really coming to the forefront, which plays well into the elements that we'll discuss here on how to help companies monetize. With that, George, let me move to the first poll question.
Great. Thanks very much, Mike, for that scene setter. The first of our poll questions today is, when is your company expecting to create new revenue from IoT? And the options are, it is already doing so today, which is option A. Option B is, it will do later this year. And option C will be in 2018. And I'll repeat the question and the possible responses. The question is, when is your company expecting to create new revenue from IoT? And answer A, it is already doing so today. Answer B, it will create new revenues later this year. And response C, it will do sometime in 2018. And whilst we wait for those results to be correlated, I just urge the audience to take the opportunity to use the Q&A panel in the display to ask Mike a question. We'll be dealing with those questions at the end of Mike's presentation, and I'll look forward to putting your questions to him as well. So if you use that panel, I'll be able to direct those towards Mike. Anyway, let's see what the results are. And, oh, that's very interesting and encouraging that 44.4% of respondents say their company is already expecting new revenue from IoT today. Mike, what are your views on these findings?
So I think it's intriguing. I would say I probably would have expected less relative to today, but I think if I take a look at recent conversations and work that we're doing with customers, not totally surprising. And again, particularly for public companies where analysts are looking for growth, this tracked pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I'd have expected almost the result curve to be inverted, but perhaps we've got a fairly pioneering audience today that are slightly ahead of the mainstream in terms of monetization. But I do think that's interesting that it looks like from these responses, a lot of companies are creating at least some revenue, and of course we're not apportioning the percentage of revenue that's coming from IoT or anything like that. So it may be that the number reflects more that there are pilot projects out there that are creating new revenues already, but a lot of the mainstream and traditional business has yet to transform.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is intriguing.
Brilliant. Well, shall we move on into your presentation in full, Mike? And I'll pass the floor back to you. Thanks very much, audience, for your responses, and thanks, Mike, for your comments.
Great. So just to level set, there are many forms of monetization that are happening out there in terms of selling data, aggregating data, and selling it. The real focus here, and of course aligns to where PTC's focus and strength is in helping customers really create new experiences through their physical products, resulting in new revenue for their brands. And so the context of these elements will come in that form. So let's begin with a story that maybe many people know. And I take a look at this in terms of business model alignment. And when I say that, this is a story about GE Aviation and how they have moved from the classical topic of moving from selling a product to product as a service. And many of the conversations that we have around this topic is really around connecting the asset. But I think the more intriguing portion of this and why they've been successful in this model is really understanding their customer and their user in terms of how their customer makes money and what their user wants. And that's normally a topic or an element where people get stuck and really kind of miss the nuance of how to be really successful in creating new revenue. And when we talk about that, we understand that, and certainly GE understands that, in the case of here, Alaska Airlines, one of their key customers driving this innovation is that airline companies don't make a lot of money, very low margin, and capital constraints are a big portion of how they're geared and how they're judged in the marketplace by analysts. And so when you take a look at the idea of moving an asset off of Alaska Airlines books, keeping it on GE's in this case, and then creating a service model where they can control their spend and control their capital, you can see here that that's going to be really intriguing for their customer. And I would ask the audience to think about, if they don't do it already, is think about going from the asset and how that asset sits on your customer's books and how you might think about that as a service in aligning your business models. Even more so is the idea that, like any software offering, whether it's what we at PTC buy and use or what our customers use, at the end of the day, it's about adoption. And if the value of that service isn't clear and understood by the user of the software, right, you're going to be less successful, particularly in a world of SaaS and cloud. And the reason for that is because people have choices, and they're not going to be stuck with software like they were in the old days. And so one of the things that we work with industrial and physical product companies with is how to understand and understand really what is driving the user value, what are they required to do in their jobs, and then translating that back into how to design and develop services that are valuable enough to be paid for. Another example, while consumer-oriented, I think still plays well into an area in B2B that is important around convenience. And whether it's B2B or consumers, people want more convenience, and they want to be able to find ways to make their job easier. And if we take a look at this case and this story, as an example, this happens to be obviously an appliance that sits in most people's homes, and many companies are taking a look at connectivity and IoT and saying, okay, I'm connected, I have an asset, I want to generate new revenue, how do I do that? And typically spend a lot of time focusing on the asset and connectivity while not looking necessarily at the environment or the experience of what happens where that asset sits. And this is a great story about how company A, looking at it from an asset perspective, having a hard time generating revenue for services, versus a company that's quite well known, being able to do this quite well in Amazon, saying, listen, we believe the opportunity for revenue is in creating a better experience while providing this service or doing this job, if you will. And so the idea of making it really easy in their case, right, to be able to order replenishable or replacement type of goods, in this case Tide, is a great story of how a company can monetize through convenience and understanding, again, what's happening in the environment of the asset and what's happening with the user. So putting that aside, what we normally see, even with companies who are generating revenue today, is companies saying, listen, we're connected, we've got assets that were valuable to our customers, and normally thinking about the asset itself and connectivity. And so where we help, and we'll jump into the more detail of all the elements, is to say, great, you're connected, you've got a well-known brand, your assets can do a lot of things, but to look at the world around assets only is typically a limiting factor that we see with customers on how to optimize revenue opportunities. And again, we've touched upon this in the earlier stories. It's really about the power of the user and the human experience. And I think people are seeing more and more, hearing more and more about the human experience relative to technology. Technology is moving very fast. There's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of capability, and to the point where understanding the user and why it matters to them, right? How it begins with why is a key factor that we find customers don't spend as much time or enough time understanding. And again, when you're selling, offering software services, understanding the user equates to adoption and usage. And without adoption and usage, you're going to be less successful relative to adding value at scale with your customers.
Great, thank you, Mike. That's really interesting. So moving on to the second of today's polls, the question is your IoT initiative within your company cross-functional and inclusive of the business and the voice of the customer? And it's a simple choice of yes or no for the response. So I'll read that question again. Is your IoT initiative within your company cross-functional and inclusive of the business and the voice of the customer? And it's a yes or no answer. And while we wait for those to come to the findings, I just remind you again to submit your questions for me to put to Mike at the end of his presentation. Great. I'll close the poll now and we'll move to the results. And it's a resounding yes. Mike, what are your observations on that?
So that's exciting, I will have to say, and I think the audience we have here, we're seeing with the answers is pretty sophisticated, and this is frankly not what we've normally seen in the marketplace, but yeah, key factor and well aligned.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a surprise to me to see the positivity in the response to the question, because I think a lot of people that I speak to probably may not even understand that question fully. But that's very encouraging, certainly. So that's highly positive. Anyway, Mike, I'll pass back to you for the rest of your presentation, and we'll catch up again at the end to put the audience questions to you. Thanks very much. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you very much. So that's perfect. So leading in and obviously getting a feel now for the audience, it'll be no surprise to the audience that when we talk to customers, one of the things that we help them with and help them understand is, playing the game of monetization is a team game, and it's not uncommon for customers to explore this phenomena or challenge or opportunity within silos, whether it be IT, engineering, or service. And so, the answer to the poll questions is exciting, and again, clearly understood that having the right players on the field is very important. So as we move into the framework, if you will, some of the things that we hear from customers, or that we might pose challenges to our customers, is thinking about why should your customer pay? Typically a question that is not at the forefront. Again, it may be with this audience, fairly from what we've seen. How do we execute, and where do we start? Some of the common challenges. So when we enter into this conversation, the two core areas that we focus on are really understanding your strategy and again, understanding the user, as we've alluded to earlier. Two key fundamental points. And then from there, helping them focus on understanding those two elements, then building on what to charge, how to charge, which is really more on the business model, how to go to market, which is often a challenge for industrial companies selling hardware, now switching to more of or adding to their portfolio a software offering or a service offering with a different go-to-market approach. And then, of course, we see the glue of pulling us all together around the technology opportunities. And again, it's not so much the individual aspects of the framework, but the ability to pull it all together seamlessly as much as possible, working across cross-functions in around these elements is not always trivial or straightforward. So if we take a look at, again, user-centric, the strategy, how to charge, what are they willing to pay, if you will, how to charge in terms of the business model, go to market, and then pull together by the technology. And again, as a reinforcement, don't forget the team, which it sounds like this audience is clearly understands of those elements. So if we dig into one of these, each of these elements a little more in detail, again, what we've seen with customers and how we've helped them is around just key elements of not so much what's the big picture strategy, but how do we take the strategy, how do we take an initiative around revenue, and then actually make it actionable and in a pragmatic way. And some of the things that we get into are around, is your goal to service your customers at a high penetration rate, meaning you want to offer a service that reaches and be connected to all your customers, or is it more of a premium offering? And the reason this gets in the way at some point is when they go to finance, there's often a disconnect between margin and the strategy around getting connected, having access to as many customers as possible, as opposed to a strategy of more of a Cadillac service. And again, this can kind of create normal debate inside, and but if not understood up front, can really be critical to how you go forward. And then again, of course, differentiation. As you're going to market in your strategy, are your competitors already connected with your customer? Are you a first mover? How are you situated today? And the reason that comes into play is customers have options and they have choice. And the idea of being a first mover versus being a secondary player or more of a rapid follower has very different implications, both in terms of what you can charge, right? Because the idea of rarity, if a service is both valuable and rare, what you can charge is very different than if it's plentiful and available. In terms of the user at a high level, there's more than this, but certainly at a high level, some of the things that we talk about and help them with are, what job is your user trying to accomplish? What happens in their day? What happens in their process? Again, think about the GE Aviation story. Why is that model successful? Why is Amazon successful? Because they understand the environment in which the user, beyond the economic buyer, but the user, and what their role is and how to make their life easier if you're going for a convenience play. What is the context of their job? How are they rewarded? How will this make them better? How will this make them reach their goals in their role? And this is more at a micro level. Again, this is not a macro level, who's buying my service, but it's actually who's using the service, which is key to adoption, and when valuable, is key to revenue and something that they will pay for. And then what to charge. Typically what we see, and in my background prior to PTC, helping customers develop products, we spend a lot of time developing products around what's the price point first. Often we find customers are stalled in the marketplace where they build an offering, they have a bill of material, if you will, and there's an internal-oriented financial goal that's been laid upon them, and it's a cost plus a margin. It's not as easy as that. Understanding up front, as you learn who the user is, what are they willing to pay for that value is a key factor. And again, we focus on helping the customer think about user-defined value as opposed to inside-out defined value. Very different conversation. And then how to charge. Again, if you take a look at the GE model, they understood their customer, their user, and how their customer's business model works to have a really good idea of what type of subscription, what type of offerings might be free, and how to charge for those things. So really understanding the customer dynamics, how your customer makes money is a key factor, and what are their strategies are key factors in understanding how to charge for your offering. Take a look back at the Amazon story, right? They're monetizing IoT by making it easier for you to buy Tide from them. Obviously, that's part of a Prime service. So you've got the membership fee, you get the membership offering, annual offering, and then making it easier for you to buy Tide from them. Apple, of course, monetizes by saying, we're going to offer the best hardware, best experience with our hardware. we'll add more features to it, and it's built into the product. So there's building the product, there's a membership monetization, and then there's a understanding how your customer's business works relative to a subscription-oriented offering. And then go to market. Typically something left to the end. And again, when we talk to industrial and hardware-oriented companies, the challenge here we see and how we help them is around aligned incentives. And what we mean by that is when we think about a service and who's selling the service inside your organization, is that person also selling a $10,000 piece of hardware equipment? And if you're selling a $1,000 annual subscription that's very strategic and maybe highly profitable, how is the sales organization incented between those two offerings relative to being important? And so while it's becoming more evident, focus, who owns the services side, who's going to have the less distractions, if you will, from selling something at a higher price point versus the service. And so ownership, especially when incubating the offering, really having a group, whether it's inside sales or a temporary dedicated sales force, really focusing on this area. We're seeing people get higher penetration rates quicker to the marketplace when there's less confusion around incentive misalignment. Another thing that we see with customers in the hardware side is typically marketing is done when the product's ready. In the software business, and many of us know, it's customary and it's okay to pre-market or coming soon offers to be able to educate and begin to build a story before you launch in marketing more aggressively before the service is available. Oftentimes for hardware, physical-oriented companies, this is a different way of thinking. In software services, we see this as more of a best practice, if you will. So technology, okay, now let's pull it all together. Technology is important, and when we talk to customers about technology and revenue, many of the things or the gaps we see is IT is looking at a lens where they've typically focused on servicing internal stakeholders. And now we're moving to a revenue model where we're serving external stakeholders. And the difference between the two, perhaps while subtle, is that the speed, the need for iteration, the need for change, and being able to scale with customers and also serving an internal stakeholder of the sales department, that's a far more dynamic, fast-moving world than often serving internal stakeholders. And so being able to iterate rapidly, having high flexibility in your technology stack, being able to move very fast, and also being able to segment and personalize your services to customers is far more important to the external world. And again, when you're thinking about differentiating in the marketplace, understanding that customers have choice, respecting that they have choice, puts a different light on the technology stack decisions when looking at IoT in terms of serving customers for revenue. And again, keep in mind, personalization, the experience, and then also the ecosystem, right, of the platform and who else it plays with is very important. So as a final wrap-up, well, almost a final wrap-up. So basically, if you take a look at those areas and putting this into a framework for PTC a bit, we help customers walk through this journey, through this framework, and then align them to really the nitty-gritty of the how and what are their requirements, what do they need across perhaps their engineering groups or their services groups. And I won't go into this in detail. It's pretty complex, but basically create help our customers create a journey map around what it takes and what they need based upon their situation to be able to achieve these things. And here's just two examples of a visual that kind of guide how we do that. And then in closing, I think in terms of parting thoughts, bottom line, I think this audience gets this. Growth is a key driver today. The user, when it comes to software services and adoption, is all important, okay? They will drive the requirements for speed, flexibility, and the experience. And then I would say, think about the technology through that lens of that dynamic world of the user, perhaps differently than you might for serving internal stakeholders.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. That was really interesting. I find it particularly interesting to hear your thoughts on how organizations are looking to IoT to generate new revenues and achieve growth. One of the questions that I have had in my mind was whether the pendulum has swung from using IoT to achieve internal operational value versus new revenue monetization. I'd guess from the responses to the polls today, and also from much of what you've said, that we're now seeing the focus come onto new revenue monetization rather than using IoT for efficiency. Is that something you'd agree with?
So I think the slight tweak I'd make to that comment is short answer, yes, but more so to say, I think the internal, being able to monetize or capture value from productivity and efficiency is certainly more understood. And I think because you can control what you do and what happens there is where people start. And we actually, I would say all of our customers start there. Number one, to learn about the technology, understand the platform, if you will, and make some mistakes along the way. And but the opportunity, frankly, for productivity with customers still is tremendous. And so I think it's more of an and as opposed to a versus would be the slight.
Yes, it's interesting.
Slight point there, and we're on the front end of revenue, frankly. And again, despite what we see from the audience here, which seems to be a pretty sophisticated group, arguably, if you take a look at what research shows, less than 30% of the companies out there are meeting their goals for revenue around IoT and what they thought it would produce. And again, at a macro level, part of what we see is the ability to work cross-functionally with the business, with the voice of customer, and then also understand that the user factors and the customer factors come into a larger play than people originally may have thought when thinking it from a asset and connectivity only perspective.
Sure. I guess that was an interesting area of your presentation, that people do need to think more about the user, because it's all very well saying that, for example, my washing machine will become a service. I'm sitting here thinking as a consumer, well, my washing machine's 2 years old. I don't need to subscribe to a service model for my washing machine, because my washing machine hopefully will last several more years. So I'm not seeing that idea that that the washing machine maker and Tide, for example, could come together to servitize the idea of my home laundry arrangements. It seems that the consumer market isn't necessarily there yet, but I can understand the appeal of that model next time my washing machine breaks. Do I move to buying a service that includes the consumables and the device, and I'll pay for that on a relatively small monthly fee? But that has to be marketed to me in a way that I find convenient, and only then can the washing machine maker move to that new revenue model. So do you think that's one of the issues, that there's a kind of consumer familiarity curve to go through?
Absolutely. And the reason for that is thinking about asset only versus the experience of cleaning your clothes. Okay? Mm-hmm. And if you take that even to a B2B setting of a function of not only what is the asset doing, but what is the environment in which the asset works, and thinking about it in terms of a system perspective. That's why you've got that struggle, and that's why, on a relative perspective, the Tide model in terms of how to monetize connectivity was more successful. Again, still learning a lot, because it provided a clear convenience that, like you just laid out, trying to understand laundry as a service within your home as opposed to perhaps outside your home, like an Uber service, if you will, is something that people can't relate to automatically. But when you take a look at the user and the environment in which the user does that job, right, that's where people find the insights to think about what's valuable.
Yeah, sure. Okay, that's interesting. Just to move on slightly, I've got another question here, and to the audience, please do send in your questions. We've got a few to work through, but there's still plenty of time, so we'll have time to answer your questions for sure if you send them in. But one question I have here is, what are one or two of the most common challenges you see that customers, and I think by this the customers are actually the organizations rather than the end customers, what are the challenges they have in delivering new revenue?
So, first of all, it's frankly making sure they're really clear on what the goal and the strategy is, because that if that's not clear through the process, if we take a look at the elements that we walk through, that'll come back each time as a barrier. And then the other thing really is I would say understanding their user. And I know you asked for two, but I'm going to add a third, and then the go-to-market is how to actually get the service to the customer, to the user, tell the right story through marketing, tell the right story through the correct sales process relative to aligned incentives, and then again, going back to how it begins with why. Why should the user pay for that service?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I've got a question that's come in. The question, Mike, is what are your most effective techniques for engaging customers in a comprehensive innovation assessment to support a successful implementation?
And I'm going to say, if that is in the context of how we would engage customers in this this approach, you think that may be a good way to answer it?
Yeah, I think so, Mike. I think that's probably the question. The word techniques was used, so I guess it's how do you help in terms of people understanding where they are.
Yep, exactly. So our approach to this normally is first and foremost workshop oriented, and the key for us is again having the right stakeholders in the room across all the functions, from finance to innovation to sales and marketing, of course IT, and really having all those people in the same room, engaging initially in a structured workshop approach around these 6 elements, and then building out a plan from the workshop, getting ideas on the table quickly and rapidly, and then from there through interview processes, and then helping them build a plan on the details through somewhat of a we'll call it more of a canvassed approach to the details of each one of these elements. And the one thing that we find is sometimes the customer does not have enough detail around the voice of customer, and there are times because we're not a user innovation consultancy, right? But we work with partners. One example would be someone like Frog Design, where we would bring them in and work with us, work with the customer to do even greater detail of understanding around their user.
Okay, sure. Another question that's come in is on a different tack, but the question is it for a startup to get better market penetration, is it better to partner with an IoT giant such as yourself, GE or Amazon, or to build a platform themselves?
I, I might answer this in a biased way.
I suspect might.
Exactly. Well, we serve startups as well as enterprise companies, and I would say that if that startup is looking to support enterprise type customers, which is kind of where we're geared, at this point, I would say you're better off working with, collaborating with somebody who plays in the enterprise arena, because it's very complex. Again, I'm more geared toward that world than if the audience is looking for more of an answer from a general consumer perspective. But there's a lot of investment out there already been made, and everyone's getting the platforms are getting more and more sophisticated and easier to use. So that would be my answer.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mike. Another question's come in asking, do you have any additional examples of the services model business in addition to the Tide example that you've given? I mean, I know there are loads of enterprise examples. I've heard of things like selling combine harvesters to farmers as a service. So, I mean, I think there's a huge number of opportunities. I don't know how much have been turned into kind of real market opportunities at the moment. But do you have any additional examples you could share, Mike?
Yeah, I can't release the name of the company, but certainly in fields like medical supply, where people are selling equipment with consumables, you're seeing a lot of work. And I would say this is really kind of version 1.0 in terms of being able to automate and the replenishables, if you will, for what the equipment requires. Very similar to the Tide model, frankly. And again, medical is very much into this. We're going to see that from discussions we've had with other partners. We're going to see the same type of thing in terms of how replenishment models work and understanding of the supply chain, all the way from aviation to heavy industrial, you name it. And again, when you think about that, it's convenience, automation, and again, providing something that their customer and their user makes their lives easier.
Okay, sure. That's interesting. So, do you see any particular business models that are typically most successful starting to emerge?
There is not one yet. There's a lot of experimentation going on, and this is the one thing that we say, talk to customers about in terms of, the technology platform, is that you need to be prepared to iterate. We have customers that have said, listen, we need your help because we have an asset, we connected it, and we just started selling our services and we're not getting any traction. What do we do now? And then we work with customers to say, listen, let's try a few things, see what the customer reacts to, right? Be agile, iterate, and then modify from there. And this is not a one-size-fits-all, cut-and-paste type of endeavor. I think people have looked at it that way, whether it be product as a service. Great, I have a product, I have an asset, and now I'll send data and create a service from that. People are still learning what works. And the reason for that is, it goes back to, again, it's just going to sound, perhaps a bit repetitive. What is your user and customer? What are their drivers? And,
sure.
and with that, the case of what's free versus what's a service. Do I build part of the value into the product as a premium? All those things are really still evolving because we're on the front end of revenue being a key driver around IoT, in all honesty.
Mm-hmm. I've had a interesting question come in, actually, that asks about the customers. And do you think the customers know about IoT, and how many years do you think it will take for them to trust the technology? Is the audience member's question. So, I mean, I guess there's an interesting thought that our audience today seem to be well aware of the opportunities and the revenue potential. But do you think there's a disconnect between where your customers are and where their customers are?
I would say absolutely, and I would even say within our customers. And again, well chronicled. I don't pretend this to be a necessarily original thought from myself, but we see it with customers all the time. Is the IoT initiative typically is owned within the industrial and B2B environments and customers that we play with. It might be the CTO, it might be the CIO, and being a new technology. And because it's not a out-of-the-box platform like ERP, where everyone knows what exactly that can do, is there's more of a level of ambiguity between the technology side of the house within our customers and the business owners. And I think, whether you hear it here or you take a look at findings from third-party consultancies like Bain or McKinsey, even before you get to your customer, there's still a learning curve and a gap between the technology team understanding the capability of the technology and then being able to translate that and have a conversation with the business around why do I care, what can that do for my business, what can that do for my customer, how can that make my life easier. And so if you look at the value chain of the technology groups that we deal with primarily, the business and the customer, there's a maturity curve there that we're on the front end of.
Excellent. Okay, and in a vein, really, I've got a question here about whether IoT sales should be vertically based, such as in automotive or industrial or healthcare, or whether they should be generic because the fundamentals are the same from industry to industry.
Great point, and I think at the platform level, to be more of a horizontal play, I think makes a lot of sense. Our findings, and I can tell you from my experience prior to even PTC, and because the opportunity is large enough, being able to take the ambiguity out of the conversation we just had about IT in the business and making it very specific to the industry, and again, going back to kind of our theme around understand your customer, understand your user, that there's enough scale, the platform is purpose-built enough to be flexible to really focus on the needs of that business. And if you think of that at a more individual level, people in those businesses, like us, we all expect personalization. And if you look at personalization at a macro level, that would lead you to the understanding that verticalization is something that makes a lot of sense, and people are going to expect you to understand their business.
Sure. I mean, I guess that's one of the big challenges for vendors in the market is you can't be an expert in agriculture and healthcare and retail all at the same time. Or do you think that vendors will have to acquire those discrete areas of expertise in order to sell effectively to the market?
I think you'll see a combination of the two. And if, I'll say from PTC's perspective, we have a heritage in certain industries, in certain verticals, that of course we're leveraging from where we've come from, but also it plays into, and frankly we think of course the strength of ours is the ecosystem. And so working with partners, in our case like a Deloitte, like an Accenture,
sure.
Certainly being compatible with SAP HANA, using partners to be experts in those verticals where you're not strong, I think is more of an approach that'll be more comfortable in this world than it was previously.
Sure. I mean, I guess the other danger there is that everyone starts replicating the wheel. And going back to your point you made earlier about not being able to necessarily cut and paste revenue models from one sector to another or from one organization to another means that almost everything looks like it needs to be bespoke. But perhaps the component that doesn't need to be bespoke is sector knowledge, which exists within each sector, and that can be tapped into using whichever technological or business approach is selected for a particular application or service. So, I mean, it does seem that we haven't probably got time to replicate the wheel and generate, and for every vendor to generate sector-specific knowledge that already exists, as you said, with the consultants and within the industries themselves. Also, that would start to radically change the cost base of providing solutions as well, I would imagine. So I'm sorry, that's not really a question, Mike. But is that how you see it going? That specialists will remain specialists and generalists will remain generalists?
I think to a degree. Again, in terms of the generalists, I think it's going to be harder to play the generalist game in the world, which what millennials expect and what the me generation. And I think when intimacy and knowledge of the customer combined with technology that is flexible and can iterate and drive speed through the system are going to be probably more important going forward than it was certainly 5 years ago. And again, if you take a look at IoT technology and connectivity to assets and understanding the usage, and you add AI on top of that we haven't even talked about, you're going to, the people that really have the intimate knowledge and can bring that into value for the customer with the right technology stack, I think are going to be the winners.
Okay, great. That's interesting. I've had another question come in, and it says, from a sales perspective, how do you define a revenue model? Would it be, for example, per device, per platform installation, TPS, or something other? I don't know what TPS means. Does it mean?
I'll tell you what. I don't want to assume what the underlying context is of that. Could we take that one offline?
Yeah, sure. I should also point out to the audience that any questions that don't get answered during the session, we'll try and answer afterwards directly, because we'll have your contact details and we can handle that. The question has told me that TPS stands for transactions per second, but I don't think that will help you to answer it anyway, Mike, so we'll take that one offline. We'll move on to the next question, and we've got time for one, maybe two more questions. But this question is, why is working within a cross-functional team so important?
Yeah, so by the way, that's a great question. So, when we work, and again, our typical, like most technology companies, you're dealing with, the IT group, and when we talk to IT or about this conversation, is basically IT and their function, depending upon where they are, kind of in the innovation stream of their company, is typically not as close to the customer every day like another department who owns the customer. And one of the things that we try to impress upon customers is that every aspect of your business, and frankly, again, Jim Heppelman and Michael Porter touched on this, will be touched by IoT, and the effectiveness of IoT, because it's not a point solution out-of-the-box platform like PLM or CAD. The ability to generate revenue, in particular, in this context, understanding the customer, connecting in the goals of finance or the inputs of finance, is very important and will save a lot of time from developing what I would call more of an inside-out push offering that doesn't have the context before it launches to the customer, of finance, and having those stakeholders involved in the process. And one of the key things that this is beyond just what PTC sees is that moving from a proof of concept to scale, one of the challenges that's been well researched is the differential between companies who work in silos versus those that tend to work across functions, like what a typical product development firm might do.
Sure, excellent. That's very interesting. Okay, I think we're almost at the point where we need to wrap up. But I've got a question for you, Mike. And it's coming back to the how begins with why point that you were talking about. How do you get to the why? Why do something? Is it that it's looking at the organization's challenge in terms of revenue and realizing that what they've historically done, i.e. build a product and sell the product through a channel and make that a capital purchase for their customers, is no longer the most efficient way, and the more efficient way and the greater revenue opportunity lies with servitization of that offering. But that seems to me only half the reason. That you would understand why a vendor would do that, because it's to their benefit. But the circle needs to be completed and bring in why the customer would want to buy the service in that way, which you've talked about extensively this afternoon. How can you help your customers work out how to complete both sides of that equation, so the end customer sees the value as well as the vendor sees the value?
And when you say you mean PTC? Is this PTC specific?
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, again, our charter is around having people that have worked in industry, typically, perhaps for like in my case, I was a customer, and bringing that experience in. We also collaborate, like I said, with firms like Frog that have deep expertise that may go beyond what the customer has for knowledge themselves. We also collaborate with other strategy consultants that if the client needs to go deeper than what they have for internal knowledge, we would then do that. And it really goes back to our partnering approach in general, right? Both in terms of whether it's technology or on advisory. And so we don't have the services in-house that if the customer needed more understanding beyond their internal voice of customer leaders, we would partner and help them pull that together and drive that plan.
Sure. Okay, great. I'd like to say thanks very much to Mike Fallon, the Director and Senior Advisor at PTC's IoT Transformation Advisory Practice. I've been George Malem, the Managing Editor of IoT Now magazine, and this afternoon's webinar has been about how to monetize your IoT investment. And I think the conclusion that we've all come to is that if the service is valuable and rare, and it's understood and wanted by the end user, the likelihood for revenue to be generated at the scale that matches the investments or even exceeds the investments that companies have made is far in advance of services that are plentiful and available and that customers don't really understand the need for having them provided as a service. So I think that's the next challenge that we'll see, and perhaps we'll all meet again in the future to discuss that as the market matures further. Thank you all very much for your time. Have a good day. Goodbye.